Thank you, everybody, for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. We were talking about Palestine before on the workshop, and my work that I'm working on in relation to Palestine or with Palestinians. However, today I will not talk about that. I still feel very uncomfortable about it, and I will rather present something else. But first of all, I want to say something more about maybe myself. I guess, Dora already said we are teaching together at KIO, or have been. I'm not teaching there anymore, but we met actually many years ago, and that was on Manifesta 2 in Luxembourg. I was just finishing my study at Rijksacademie in Amsterdam, where I did my very short art education. Otherwise, I'm educated as an architect, and I'm kind of working interdisciplinary. I'm interested in many different fields, and of course, feeling short on knowledge always, trying to cooperate with different people. So I'm interested in examining somehow the alternatives, and alternatives that might suggest some futures. So I would work on projects that are related to perhaps urban planning and questioning urban policies and social engagement. I would work usually in cooperation with people on site. It would be very important for me that I do find local or cooperation partners that knows very well the local context. And my work is related very much to the context. So I produce work that is not really possible to move from one space to another, but it's very much related for the space where it was produced and to people who were working with me, and to audience that comes from that place as well. I'm going to share the screen again. I hope you feel comfortable everywhere you are. This is gonna be a bit longer story. Just a second, before I start with my story and sharing my story, I will say something more about our meeting with Dora. Yes, because that's, I want to point out, because when she invited me, I started to think about our history, and Dora is very interested in history. She's a real, I would say, historiographer, and I'm like hanging on the history. I'm perhaps more interested in how the future could look like, or how the future could be. But as I said, the Luxembourg gave us some common point. Namely, we were situated in the same space of a warehouse that was transformed into exhibition space. And her exhibition, her installation was on the balcony, I remember very well. It was on the on the first floor. Mine was on the ground floor, and I was very much insisting that the door, the big door to the warehouse, have to be open to my juice bar. I made a juice bar, orange juice bar, that was called Bonnevoie. That was also the neighborhood name, and that was a Portuguese neighborhood. I was pretending I have Portuguese oranges, making the juice for the neighbors. I was also interested in the place itself, as it was a place with kind of history of a storage for fruit and vegetables that was later on distributed into a city center to, you know, fancy shops and restaurants. And Luxembourg is a fancy place. So yeah, I remember Dora's installation as being very red. And I found an image about the installation, which I was looking for a little bit. And that's the only image I found. And here I'm sharing it with you. You see, yeah. So I guess the red color is something Dora is sticking to it. And I was translating this text here. I remember there was sound and there was text, but I couldn't remember what it was about. The text doesn't say so much what it was about, but the text that Dora wrote was autobiographical in relation or in mix dub with DJ produced music on the site and the ambient music of the ambience. I will leave it to this point, and I will go to my presentation. Yeah, this is maybe where I should start. So this, you can see my work at Manifesta in '98. The work is an orange juice bar. Obviously my work was very orange, but it had a kind of pretending to have produced also the TV program that was running on these monitors on the wall. And the TV program was about the neighborhood in my own way. So that was kind of my interpretation of it. I hired a dancer from the city, from Luxembourg, who was sort of measuring the space, and I recorded him dancing in the space. Well, and then I looked into the catalog that we produced at that time, and that was a text that I forgot about. And I got interested in that text suddenly, because the text that Robert Fleck wrote is titled Art After Communism, ? So he also claims that was the first big exhibition when East and West contemporary art would be joined together. And indeed, there was a lot of people from ex-Yugoslavia, where I come from, but we were not sort of fulfilling the expectations of the curators, I would say, or the ones who were investigating who to invite beforehand, because simply we were not reflecting on the Balkan War. We were reluctant to reflect on that. Most of us didn't. And I remember this sort of expectations being clearly laid out on me when I was having conversation with different curators, why I'm not in any way making art more political, and why I'm not reflecting on the Balkan War directly. I'm not going to answer this question because I didn't answer it then either. But it is a very conscious personal decision, and namely has a lot to do with powerlessness, I would say. Well, what he wrote further on, he says, so Robert Fleck from Manifesta 2 catalog, he says, the children of the implosion of communism, for whom there is no longer any alternative to capitalism, have over the recent years in formal aspects taken an opposite standpoint towards the social environment. This includes the accentuation of procedural as against object, picture, or product, related moments in the work of art. And indeed, I was not ever interested in the art object as the object of discussion, but rather reflect upon the production of space, as Lefebvre would write. I was kind of my first work was very much related to my interpretation, of the production of space. I was recycling wax, for example, for 3 years at the Rijksakademie. which also leads into questioning capitalism eventually, and the capitalist production of space that would brought me back to ideas of communism, this time rather discussing the commoning or the common as a way to take control over our living environments from below. And I would, therefore, what Caroline talked last week, it was very resonating with me, but on the other hand, it has been how I lived it, was very much produced from above. It was very much produced from the government. The whole idea of solidarity, brotherhood, and mutual care was something that was put into our education programs, was something that we were supposed to read about, and was something that we were also supposed to practice, of course. But on the other hand, the way that communism was developed in ex-Yugoslavia, which we all feel a bit nostalgic about, by the way, is also that it was very much controlled. The mechanisms of control were extremely high. And at the end of the day, I suppose this has a lot to do with insecurity of the powers and untrust to people. So maybe we should keep in mind, if you want further on to discuss the commons and the commoning. I got interested in the intersection with the viewer. I was interested always in the viewer or the user of the space, and with people who would come and see the exhibition or who would actually produce the work with me. I thought these are already the audiences, these are already people who I can build community, or I have built temporary community with them. I got interested in the intersection with the viewer or with people who would come and see the exhibition, as well as with people that I would meet through the production process of the work. For me, everyone was a potential audience or a discussion partner. I started to build situations where people would meet, work together, or discuss, since I thought that is needed in order to produce the new reality. Until the point that somebody started to call this kind of practice relational practice, or participatory, or finally socially engaged practice. All those categorization came into place afterwards, I would say after 2006 onwards. And I'm not very impressed with those categorization, I must say. However, with my research, I'm reflecting on the notion of participation, indeed, that is in most theoretical writing within arts taken for granted. Many of the academic texts about participation within art mainly describes participatory act when it is in motion, but they don't know much about the production of it, unless they have been part of the production themselves. To organize participatory process is a lot of work, and especially if one works with groups of people or individuals who are not exactly from the same community, who maybe even don't share necessarily the same goal. Participants as a subject has been participation as a subject has been widely discussed, used and abused, not only in the art practice, but wider in the interdisciplinary field of spatial practices. And in relation to urban issues especially, it became a kind of legitimation for performing democracy for official urban development projects. Although it might be a golden hammer with a positive value, it must be, in my opinion, examined very critically and not just taken for granted. The danger is that we might even end up overrating it and therefore dismiss its real potential within the production of agonistic relations, if I would here quote Chantal Mouffe. It is necessary to examine the situation critically and create strategies that lead into action. That is what I've been developing through my practice-based research. Such strategies are necessary when working with situation in this moment, the aim to create a suggestion for change. I propose a type of change that is shaped through a process developed from the context of the situation. Thus, every proposal is then unique. We can share methods, but have to be aware of specificities and develop actions that would be context sensitive. And every process is an experience that produces awareness and creates relations between the people involved. It is a network of relations that will eventually provoke an action. The change is possible only when we produce individually the self-awareness through the collective interaction or cooperation through the intersubjective relation. And of course, we are talking about the change that is beneficial for all, or at least majority of people, not only for the 1% of the population. When we talk about the change with the urban development, for example, that is easily only beneficial for a few people. I mean, when we talk about developments, urban developments, these are extremely profitable and can damage quite a lot of social fabric. Here, I would like to emphasize the changing role of the artist with participatory within the processes, from being the one who is responsible for the process, who is the organizer, moderator, negotiator, to a person that would think of a new strategies and construct new situations, push the process to unfold and in most unexpected way, and finally inspire others around her to take action. I'm proposing the role of the artist working with people and urban change in public space being described as Foucault's idea of specific intellectual, where somebody is sharing the powers of knowledge, rather than imposes it upon the participants in the project. Working together is an exchange and sharing process, the process of observing, listening, translating, and finally leading possibly into the action. I'm gonna give you a story of one project only because it is a long story, and you're very welcome to interrupt me or to give me some sign. Here we are in Hústadt. The title of the project is Hústadt Inshallah, and I'm working together with Actions team, which was informal group of people, of activists from the area. And yes, I was invited to Hústadt by the city of Bochum, and that was now its history, right? It has been in 2008. Somehow they were told by the Gallery M that I would be the right artist to invite to do the work in Hústadt, in the neighborhood itself. And I don't think that the commissioner knew much about my work, because that was quite clear when we started to work, because their expectations were very different from what I was, how I was setting up the process. It was a commission for the 9 months, and I insisted there is no prescription to it. I was working with several people, but I will be mentioning them through the process. I came to Hústadt. I was quite amazed by the space, the place of the neighborhood itself. It was built in the 60s, the end of the 60s, as a university campus. Now you can see a little bit where it is situated. No, it is in Bochum, is part of Bochum, but is southeast edge of Bochum, on the edge of the forest as well. The neighborhood was built by an architectural office, Dustmann. It was a kind of old office who The main person used to work for Walter Gropius before the war, but in the war he had some strange association with Hitler even. Anyhow, this is the working process or the building process of the Hustadt project in the 60s. And it was inhabiting about 25,000 people. They came from the Ruhr University, workers from the Ruhr University. They would be, professors and also service workers. There would be also some student housing. What I found in the archives at that moment, they were already talking about utopia that is gonna be, or that is happening in Hustadt, but utopia in a good way. They were all very much looking forward to it. They also mentioned at that time already Uni-Ghetto. Now, through the years, when I arrived, it had a stamp of just a ghetto without Uni. And seriously, there were, how can I say, considerations and sort of, struggle of people who lived in Hustadt, that they were stigmatized, they couldn't get the job because of the address. There was a polemic about kids not being accepted to gymnasium. All that, of course, is illegal in Germany, but in a way that came out as well. It was questioned, it was discussed when I arrived to Hustadt. I decided to move to Hustadt. I lived here on one of these blocks. How can I? My mouse doesn't work. I'm sorry. I wanted to show you where, but never mind. Anyhow, I was looking to Brunnenplatz, and I enjoyed all this green. It is a very green place, and it reminded me a little bit of Scandinavian urban planning, with the wild nature coming into the neighborhood. I realized there is a certain issue coming up in Hustadt as well. And looking at the graffiti that I found around, or for example, all the shops that were supposed to be in Hustadt because it was big enough to supply people with food, they were not really there, so they got supplied through mobile shops. I got concentrated in observing this square a lot, and I mean, lots of my meetings would be happening also on this square. This is called Brunnenplatz Square, and if you would ask a taxi driver to take you to Brunnenplatz, they wouldn't know where it is, and they wouldn't find it on Google either. So it was a bit of a hidden place. I was analyzing it a bit. There was a Catholic church mainly. There was IFAG migrant organization. VBV was a housing corporation. Pizza Bella Bepona was run by an Afghani person, as well as kiosk. Of course, Hustadt was much bigger than what I showed you right now, this fragment, but that's what I was looking at, Brunnenplatz, that one square. Now, and of course, I met people from all over Hustadt. Now, when they gave me information about Hustadt, they gave me this, and this made me quite surprised, because suddenly there was 54.9% of others, which they didn't know who they are, or that was not specified. But on the other hand, the minority of non-German population seems to be quite small. However, the image that I got wasn't telling me this. Was telling me these people are coming from somewhere else. I didn't take these pictures right away, I have to say. I was a bit shy at the moment I arrived to Hustadt and I started to live there, because going around with a camera in a place like that felt extremely odd. I first had to get my foot in, and I had installed myself, and I wanted to meet people. So I had to present myself. And I present myself on the little presentation in the school, because that was the only place where people would come, or the only assembly hall that would be somehow appropriate to for people to come to and that I could invite them to, since the church assembly wasn't very welcoming. The Catholic Church didn't go very well along with maybe Muslim population in Hustadt. I didn't speak German at the time, and I was trying to tell that to people. So my lecture and my presentation was a lot about pictures and body language, and asking them to help me to express myself. I was going around presenting myself also to individual people and organizations, trying to get as much information as possible. I would meet for breakfast at the Hufelandschule, that was the elementary school in Hustadt. For example, this is the rector at the time. She was very generous. She organized breakfast for mothers who had children in the school. And I was also allowed to come to join them, to meet them, to talk about issues in the neighborhood. I'm showing you these pictures with a lot of people, and these people knew that I'm going to work with these pictures, and they agree with that. They also, at one point in the process of the project, they got pictures they wanted to have for themselves. I was organizing workshops in the space that I shared with another organization that was called Stadtumbaubureau. And Stadtumbaubureau was an organization that was trying to place or to introduce regeneration process to people. My project was somehow parallel, but of course we were cooperating. And both of the people employed in Stadtumbaubureau, they were very generous and open. But of course, they worked as employees of the city. No, they were put there as commissioned from the city, but they had private offices, I think. That was so. I invited people to talk about Brunnenplatz. That was the square. The questions were, how did they came to Hustadt? What do they remember from that time? And of course, there were different reflections from different times, because they were coming to Hustadt in different times. And we were also discussing the present and the future, and some ideas. How do they imagine? A lot of people at the time wanted to move out of Hustadt. It was somehow too much for them. So the process was going through several little projects, and another project that would come out of this process is Handy Photo Hustadt, that I've done together with the students from the university, art history students. We invited people from Hustadt to take a photograph of Hustadt by themselves. And then the idea was to present those photos as an exhibition outside of Hustadt, to tell people outside of Hustadt how Hustadt is, in fact. And it's not a scary place or whatever. I mean, they presented it in different ways, I have to say. So there were different kinds of photos that we selected. We also have a jury prize and a public prize for the photo, which we gave on the Hustadt Festival. Every year there was a Hustadt Festival that then the project also participate in. And here is the picture of the jury. The jury was from people from Hustadt, from organizations in Hustadt, students, and the university professors and professional photographer. And we had exhibition at the university as well, which was a little bit more looking into the history. And finally, this got the winner, photograph winner, and got the inauguration at the university. The prize was given to the kids who were photographing together, and the public prize was given to a student, in fact. This is a kind of diagram of all kinds of activities that we have been doing together. Maybe I should say something about Aktionsteam. How did I met them? I met them, in fact, on my first presentation. That first presentation, I presented my work and what I do, and these people got very suspicious, of course. So I invited them. I said, please, if you want, I would be very happy to hear more about your concerns and what is it that you're concerned about, and could we find some common ground and maybe think about the Hustad future together. So we did. We met very many times, several times while we were meeting on the 2009, the whole year, literally every month or even every 14 days, it depends what was necessary, because we decided to not only sit and talk, but we decided also to do certain actions that would test the square, the Brunnenplatz. We were concentrating on the Brunnenplatz. Well, we could concentrate on anything else, in fact, but Brunnenplatz was our place. And we started to concentrate with actions that we could do individually together. People were proposing these actions by themselves, and they also have done them by themselves, but we were discussing them, what is appropriate, not to maybe hurt anyone, or how to involve people in these actions. And this is a part of the schedule. So we had a dancing course. We had, as I mentioned, Handy Photo Hustad, but we had the action to build a temporary pavilion, which was called then Umbaustelle Hustad. We had, Willy Unger decided to read books to children or storytelling. We started a small garden, or one of the persons started a small garden. People proposed as well to open migrant office, the IFAC, the organization that was taking care of the migrants, and it was usually, organizing language courses for migrants, to invite a German population into their space, because those people usually they wouldn't come. That was quite a struggle, in fact, and not so easy. It was, you could sense certain tensions there. And building the small garden, which was, we were very happy that it was growing, and people were quite fond of it, coming and looking, and nobody did anything actually to it except watering. And Silke Bolestra did her bicycle workshop. She was interested in maybe setting up that as a kind of permanent work for herself as well. She did also other kinds of workshops with kids. And I was negotiating then with politicians. These are local politicians from Bochum, and they were extremely skeptical of what we are doing. So that was not so smooth. You can see the plan, which was not done by me or anything, but that was the regeneration plan that was done by landscape architecture office. What is it called? well, Christina Wolf was her name, but forgot now the name of the office. Anyhow, they were proposing the design of the square, but as we didn't know what do we want on this square, we were just doing these temporal actions. We were still trying to find out. We had very vague idea of whether we want anything there at all. But I was reporting about the actions, and I was reporting about how, you know, people are engaged with gardening, and how people are desiring a place to meet. There is no place to meet or any roof where they could meet under the roof. So we start to build this temporary pavilion out of some given material. In fact, we had the budget, but we were trying to spare that budget for maybe something bigger or something else. We were trying out here to build a pavilion where the old existing structure and the betonplexplatte we got donated through the gallery. We made this kind of very simple box and a kiosk with tables. And of course, that was very much popular for the kids immediately. Then together with other organizations, social organizations in Hustadt, we organized the Hustadt Festival, and this board, as information board, was a display for, you know, more and more information was gathering of what we are doing to try to inform people what is going on. And you can see the poster from Annika Eriksson, video artist, the session. She allowed us to screen her video. We had also other artists then coming and screening, and this is the open air cinema program. Yeah, it was extremely popular. This was absolutely the top, and people were very, it was a very dear moment, I have to say, of the project. Well, we went further on with a garden workshop, and that was mainly for the kids. Parents would come along, but they wouldn't really participate, but the kids would. The kids were on their own. They were just running around, and they would be always prepared to do something. Parents would come then later to see what is happening, and they were somehow ambassadors, you know, of communication with the parents, in fact. And at this moment, I have been in Hustadt already for so long that people start to get to know me, not only me, but also the active members of Actions team. Finally, we decided to propose a community pavilion. We proposed the roof, the common roof, and this is what I designed out of our proposal. Let's say this is my interpretation of what we were discussing. And it should be a neighborhood cinema. It should have a kiosk. It should have a meeting place. It should have a garden that was already growing. So it should have all these elements. But on this meeting here, that was, you know, after 9 months when I was supposed to deliver a project. I delivered a proposal only. And I said, we are here connected with this and these people. We are working together, and we are proposing a community pavilion. And this was very, very vivid, very polemic discussion with the Stadtumbaurat, so the city planning office, and the boss of the administration, and so on. And there are several members of the Actions team on this meeting. And basically, my commissioner rejected the project. So they said there's no money for that. You had some money, or you have some money, but that's not enough, and you cannot build anything like that. Apolonija, we are sorry. I got a bit shocked, because this was the point where, you know, where people expected something to happen. They put a lot of energy into it. It wasn't only me anymore, it was others too. And they wanted to have something physically realized. It was important for them that this something would happen. So we took some time. I must say that at this time, it was extremely important that I had this other connection who invited me to Hustadt, namely this gallery. And Susanne Breidenbach was that very active in lobbying in the municipality for the project. We had made our own calculation of the project, and we proposed to the city to build the structure, the concrete structure with the wooden structure, and we will take care of the roof ourselves and also of our other elements. For that proposition, we had to sign the letter of intent, which we did. And we kind of obliged ourselves, not very legally really, but just give us some kind of reassurance that we are interested in carrying on. So the city, we were waiting now. The city started to build the project. The pavilion was coming up. It was surprising for all of us. Of course, suddenly it's a real thing. But at a certain point, it stopped here. So it didn't have the roof, it didn't have anything. And this was the point where I took also, meanwhile, of course, I had to fundraise a lot. And I have got extra funding. And we were able to finish it ourselves. But we didn't get the building permission for finishing it. We had, according to the bureaucracy of the city of Bochum, we had to donate what we have gathered, the money we got, to the city in order to ask the city to continue with the work, a very absurd kind of Kafka situation. That was taking time, that was taking a long time. So we were meanwhile, I would say, occupying one space on the ground floor, making it into a meeting cafe, a very crazy one. I invited a painter that was my friend, Mari Rantanen, to paint in her colors the whole space. We were collaborating on that, or I was her assistant actually, and we had very much fun to do this. We opened the cafe with lots of other information, and the ladies, a bit older ladies of the neighborhood, they would come every Monday to have their breakfast, and the thing starts to roll on. But on the back side, we had extreme push or kind of pressure from the CDU, from the Conservative Party, who was influencing also this news here, which is quite a negative news about the Hustadt project, about the pavilion, about the whole project. In fact, trying to emphasize how much it cost and, you know, is it worth it or whatever. So we were navigating. This is Matthias Kollmann, by the way, who is also one of the protagonists of the projects. We were navigating further on. We came to another obstacle, which was the fact that we got an audit office on our back, and that was in 2010, when all the, yeah, I mean, obviously we went further on after 2009. All the German cities got a revision, and this project was harshly revised. I had to produce a document of 500 pages to defend the project and to show how the money has been spent. To that point, we still didn't have the building permission to finish the project. So finally, I asked the mayor to look into the situation again and really pushed for getting the building permission. And that's why they were discussing this on 28th of April in 2011. Again, in the Parliament of Bochum, in the City Council, about our project, about the money, and how, you know, whether whether they are going to give us a permission or not. We were sitting on the public balcony recording this, and we have some documentation in video as well. And it was absurd to hear this discussion between politicians who didn't care, didn't know where Hustadt is, didn't care what has been done until then, didn't care about people in Hustadt, but only talking about money. Finally, we got a permission, and finally we organized ourselves. We did the roof ourselves again, without, too much hassle with the building regulation and protection and so on, because we simply didn't have enough money to do some kind of building site, proper building site. But everybody was somehow involved, and even the kids were around. By that point, they already knew how to behave. They were very, they obeyed. They were kind of disciplined as well, that they would help, but they wouldn't, they wouldn't take away machines that they were not supposed to touch or things like that. So we were a kind of open building site. Also, these guys were quite helpful. This is the garden that we got to grow, meanwhile, that we put behind the pavilion, with the lady that helped a lot and donating quite a lot of plants as well. And we are coming towards finishing the building, the pavilion itself. We inaugurated it in September 24, 2011, with the kind of mixed program of a local artists and international artists, and press conference where we wanted to discuss some very urgent questions. For example, the question about how to perform sustainable participation, because of course we can, push the project to a certain point with the money that we had, but how is this going to work further on? And can we include people in participating further on? That question remained. How to support the socially engaged actors who has proved during the process of the project being extremely important for further development within the neighborhood. So these questions were addressed to the city authority and possibly were hanging in the air, and they were not completely answered, but they were hanging in the air. And this is the part of inauguration when we were sort of playing out the whole pavilion, how it could be. I wanted to have a speech as a performance as well on that occasion. We had a Kurdistan football team. By the way, if you remember, the Turkish population wasn't Turkish population, obviously, but it was Kurdish. And you can also remember the tag that I showed you with PKK. It was a lot of Kurdish people living in the area, highly politically aware, interesting, and good people to discuss. This is Gitta Willesen presenting her video, Juju White Magic. Among other people, Pia Rönecke has presented also another film that she has done with a Kurdish writer, and so on. I mean, we had then another program. Barbara Steiner, as a curator, was talking about public art. So it was a mixed program with mixed public. And of course, each of them were wondering, what is this? But still being and participating and being there and listening and being curious. And that was how it worked then a little bit after. I stayed some months after, and then I left Hustadt. And I moved to, I think I went back to Amsterdam, and then to Scandinavia. Inshallah. So I would finish my story here. However, the story had its continuation, and from my side, I built up an archive that I presented also within my PhD dissertation. I still have this archive. It is in my studio, and it is available for people who are interested in investigating this project. They can make an appointment with me and I will show them. I haven't been showing much of it really elsewhere. However, the main protagonists also took it further. They are carrying on, and in a kind of interesting way. Right after that, Karin Mund has been involved as a curator for film, and she was leading, well, we were doing this somehow together, but she was much more involved than carrying film workshops in the pavilion. I guess it's, there are a lot of after stories as well. This is just the final. I was SMSing to Matthias Kollmann, who is still very present in Hustadt. I have been visiting them for twice in between, and he really developed his own project out of it. Maybe Katrin can even say something. I think she's in the audience, how she sees it. I will ask you now to yeah, to reflect on this, what I showed you, to ask or to give me some suggestions, some questions, some reflection. So thank you very much for listening. For me, it always feels very short, but it's very, very long, I suppose. I can just talk. Hustadt has a lot of stories, actually. Yeah.
Thank you, Apolonija. I don't know if Katrin wants to say something. Is Katrin the name of the participant that is with us?
Maybe she's not here anymore. Okay, maybe not. Okay.
Then maybe I can ask something or I can comment something. So I find it quite significant that the project is called Inshallah, because Inshallah contains a vision of the future already. It is a hopeful vision of the future, of a good future. And so I retain very well. You embarrassed me without end showing a work of 1998. And you say that you always have been more occupied with the future than with the past. And this idea of the art as visionary or envisioning a future is something that calls me. We have been discussing in the workshop 4 texts. One of them is a text of Ingar Emmelheit's about John Berger. And the quote of John Berger said, I translate now from the Spanish, so maybe it's not super accurate of the original English, is art has to be precise, hopeful, and it has to fight for a collective consciousness. And this immediately sent me as well to this famous quote of Angela Davis, is that we have no other option but to be hopeful. And it is in collectivities that we find reservoirs of hope and optimism. So there seems to be a very strong relation between hope, visionary visions of the future, hope and collectivity. I was just wondering if this is, you could say, this is a sort of leitmotif in your work.
Yeah, that, I mean, of course, is I enjoy working with others, simply to say. I think it's important to share opinions and ideas and visions and joy and, you know, also trouble, in fact, because there can be a lot of struggle and fights as well. So working together with others is not just a smooth process and happy family kind of thing, but it is what MOVE would decide or describe as agonistic, is something that can drive you crazy, but then you must find the way together somehow to find a way out. And okay, even respecting differences, still carry on. So I think that I'm many times wondering, you know, about the arts, and coming also from architecture and still remembering working within architecture context with teams of people was never a question. However, of course, that process end up always serving to some profitable enterprise or whatever. And but in arts has always been very much about the artist's genius. However, it's good to see this other development through the years, where you get more and more groups of artist groups, or mixed groups of people who work together simply on interesting projects. And what I'm actually concerned more about is the pedagogical processes, the conventional ones within our conventional art institutions, where, for example, I was teaching. It's extremely difficult to introduce collective work or collective project. I know, Dora, that you have been doing that regularly in your group, and because your department has had also different organization. But in my department, that was quite difficult to do. There were different structures in place, and kind of break them up was, you know, a fight. So I think it's extremely important to introduce the working together, the methods of working together early on within the art education, especially in art education, I would say, because that's not really the case in most of the art education. I'm talking about formal art education, of course. People needs to get used to work with each other, to listen to each other, to have also fight with each other, and to be able to come together through the hard moments too. Yeah.
We have a question.
Yeah.
From Caroline Bullard. Can you say more about that? How you shift the education?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe that's something what Dora could actually say quite good, but I would like to introduce much more of education where people works in teams together, where they can find also external partners to work with, where they are aware that the issue they are discussing, perhaps, or the work itself has a wider echo, and other professional fields are maybe involved in it. And I'm sure, Caroline, you know this very well, how that is, that people who don't know anything about art, and what kind of communication then one has to establish in order to open up, simply. Art context is very locked in itself, as others as well. And then how can this communication be established between different professional fields is also a question. We would call interdisciplinarity already when one works in theater and the other works in visual art. But what about when somebody works in geography and another one works in visual art? And how does these people communicate about the work together, let's say? So I think this should be introduced. How? Yeah. I guess projects, experiences, meeting people outside of this locked down institutions, basically, and give much more. Lately, I'm teaching for a long time, since 2003, and at that time, when Bologna was not yet introduced to Europe, was much easier to have that sort of experimental teaching in place. Nowadays, it's almost impossible. You know, you get a crazy dean who's, sorry to say, who's just, you know, applying some structure on the program, and you have to fulfill it. And that's it. So yeah, maybe one has to start more of experimental education like AFIELD. I think that's much more beneficial. Yeah.
There's a comment by Mao. I guess this is addressed to Apolonija Mao. This is wonderful and very similar to ethnography, but I'm not sure why you say that your work is not political. I don't know if I heard you say that.
I didn't really say that. I just, I know what you're referring to, the beginning where I say that I rejected to do political work, but I meant that I didn't want to comment on the war. I didn't want to comment on the Balkan War. So of course, you know, through the time, this kind of critique that I'm producing is attached to some critique of the, well, maybe the way I'm doing it is also has a political aspect. I mean, I also take a role of negotiator, for example, or I take the role of I don't know, an agency that that wants to, you know, instigate something and get going. So there are certain, I guess, strategies that one could decide they are political in the work. Yeah.
I have a question from Prem Krishnamurti. I read, in thinking about the problem of teaching collaboration in art programs, I am curious if you can talk about specific tools or skills that you might need.
Yeah, well, what would it be? Yeah, I guess we have to learn to listen, first of all. And then we have to learn to listen to each other and trying to understand each other, and then not to be critical immediately on the first step and canceling out everything, but be generous and try to, you know, try to complement each other's ideas. Not you know, not being kind of not canceling out each other's ideas, but rather building upon the tools for that.
But Apolonija, don't you think that there is also a question of hierarchy, especially in art schools, because most people expect the famous image of the student as an empty container that the teacher has to pour wisdom into, while in fact the idea that the teacher immediately puts themselves at the same level of paraphrasing García, ignorance of the students in a school, that already gives a certain group dynamic, I would say, where everyone speaks out. I don't know if you agree with that. For me, for instance, that is a first step always.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's definitely the case. I think, you know, I was very reluctant, in fact, to include students into my work, because I thought on the MA level anyway, they would be very independent and interested in different issues, not what I'm interested in. But we can share methodology, and that's something we could discuss as also as tools, and what kind of tools one has to develop. But I just think it's also very fun to work together on the same project, and it's not necessarily mine. So I think that's how I could imagine ideal education. A lot of it is experience as well. And maybe you should say, Dora, yourself, because you have been engaging people into your work, but you were very generous with naming a group, you know, Rosehammer, for example, and then giving them, or they were selecting, I don't know, you should say tasks by themselves, what they want to do within this group. Maybe you can say something about this.
Yes, I say something about it, and then I read a comment by Abby that says the yes and that we should think of yes and culture instead of the no but culture. And yes, regarding this, well, this is you who is the protagonist here, but I have to say that I see things completely different. I don't think I'm generous by, how you say, dissolving my subjectivity into a common name for everybody, so as to say, relinquishing my, I'm not even sure that's English, giving out my authorship to the group of students. So I actually see myself as someone who's the main, the one who really benefits from that, in the sense that it is the subjectivity of the students, that the one that is giving vitality to the project. I always think of myself, and they laugh when I say that, I see myself as a vampire, that the only way I can keep myself young is by sucking the blood of young students. So in that sense, of course, this is a joke, but that's a bit the image, you know. The only way I can keep myself from fossilizing completely is if I benefit from the generosity of the students. So they are the ones that are generous, not me. That's what I wanted to say regarding this. And there's a young person entering my room now and saying, no, go away. And I also wanted to say, there is another question from Mao. Another question, do you always work with the same intensity? But if we are very strictly to end at 7:30, I also didn't want to, I wanted to mention that to me, the enemy gave a wonderful headline for the work. This, where is the artwork? This is a absolutely fantastic question, because this is what I'm asking myself all the time, where is the artwork? Yeah. And it is indeed absolutely fantastic that the artwork is nowhere to be seen. It's everywhere and nowhere. But the question of Mao is, do you always work with the same intensity? Yeah. Apolonija.
Yeah. Well, what do you mean by intensity? Really, like what the length of, or like, I guess I'm always very involved. Yeah, no, when I work on a project, and I would actually only work when I'm really immersed in the project. I guess otherwise I leave it. And there has been projects that I didn't feel so connected to even. And they were projects as well, projects that they would be canceled, of course, because I got too intensive. And maybe they were touching too much of the, actually they were supposed to be done in Spain, one in Madrid and one in Santiago de Compostela. And I was just too annoyed by this Monte Gaia that Eisenman was building. And I produced some work that was quite critical. And then at one point, the museum just canceled the project in 14 days. That was some time ago. So people are not anymore in place. But yeah, I think it's just necessary. I would not usually, not all the projects are 3 years or 4 years or 5 years long, but some of them are. And not that I work on them constantly, but like the Palestinian project is just so dear or somehow so difficult. And then I always thought I can't work for biennials because they're so short. They have such a short production time. But then eventually I worked on 2 big biennials from 2016 in Gwangju and 2019 in Timisoara. But I was, I guess the curator knows me and knows the trouble that she's getting with me, meaning that I demand also some work from these institutions. And that made some people quite surprised. I think art institutions have certain obligation to, within the production process, when they ask you for the work. Simply.
Apolonija.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we're gonna have the last question from Tembela, and
Yes.
I would ask that to speak up instead of me reading, and with that we close the session. You know, I'm always very focused on finishing in time. So please, Tembela.
Good evening, guys.
Hi.
I just have a question. I think maybe an advice would be great. I just want to know how do you work with politicians, because here we have a project that we want to implement in schools whereby structures of the township schools and rural areas are not being taken care of, especially toilets, especially offices and meeting offices. Those kind of structures are literally, the government does not take note of anything that is happening in townships and rural areas. And now we've just compiled a research about what has been happening around the areas. And now we have the full information. And when we try to get funding to government to implement what he's not doing, and we don't get funding from them. And now we were trying to know is it possible for other countries or other people from other world that can be able to join and do this thing that we really, this project that we really want, because the government is literally not putting an effort of rebuilding the infrastructure of our schools, and the kids are, some of them, they're dying in terms of they went to bathrooms or toilets. Some they will fall inside, some will, like, you know, there's a lot that is happening in terms of building structures in school in South Africa. So I just want to know, how do you work with the government in that side, or the politicians, because this side is really hard?
Well, I'm not really an expert in you know, South African situation, and I would say I wouldn't know really, but my experience with politicians, sometimes I did in different contexts, I had to address them. I had to ask them the same question 3 times in different ways in order to answer. So you know, they try to find another way. That's the way that I think the globally politicians try to react on questions that are not, they don't want to hear. But I would, well, it's a hard one. If I don't know if I could have any suggestion for you directly to resolve that, but even in Europe, let's say from my experience in Europe, there wouldn't be any democratic way to reach them, but there would be lobbyists, the ones who are close to them, who would start persuading them, which is quite shameful, in fact, but that's the fact in many cases. And if you just write them and, you know, and show them the case and so on, usually in the time of the election, that's also the time they promise everything. So mind the time, I don't know.
I want to give a lot of thanks to Apolonija and to AFIELD and to Mao for making this workshop possible that ends now here. And many thanks to everybody who came to listen to Apolonija.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.